Good communication is actually quite simple. You just need to say the right things in the right situations. However, figuring out what is appropriate for the situation, what the truth of the situation is, can be quite difficult. But we learn how to do it today. Welcome to the Soft Skills channel. My name is Sebastian Jung, and today we are once again talking about communication and about Schulz von Thun. Because Schulz von Thun states that good communication needs to satisfy two requirements. First, it needs to be in accordance with myself. It needs to be authentic. Second, it needs to be in accordance with the situation. It needs to be appropriate to the situation. However, what does this actually mean? It means that we show the behavior that is required in the situation and that is expected of us, at least to some degree. Imagine the following behavior pattern. I am in a good mood, I have a happy face, I'm smiling, I'm laughing, I am telling silly jokes and funny stories. I am a jokester and an entertainer. Now, this behavior would be perfectly appropriate in a social gathering with some friends, maybe in the evening with some food and some drinks, where everybody is having a relaxed and cheerful conversation. However, if I bring this jokester to a stiff business meeting, this won't go as well. It would be quite uncommon and the other participants probably wouldn't be pleased. And if I bring this jokester to a funeral, the reactions of the other participants will probably be outright negative. They will probably be offended and quite displeased, because this jokester would be in stark contradiction to the kind of behavior that is actually expected in such a situation. And this is also one of the most important things that can go wrong. A communication that is off, that is inappropriate. It may be true to myself, it may be authentic, maybe I am such a jokester and entertainer type who is happy and cheerful, but it is not in accordance with the situation, it is not appropriate. Another variation of how things can go wrong, the opposite version would be communication that is over-conformist and over-adapted, where I try to please, where I try to adjust to the requirements of the situation, but I totally neglect to be true to myself and to be authentic. Think back to the example of the jokester in a social gathering with friends where everybody is in a good mood. Now imagine I would really be in a very bad mood in this situation. There was some crisis, some major disappointment, so I am really down and depressed and sad and in a very bad mood. However, I say to myself, oh, you don't want to drag the mood down, and you don't want to disappoint your friends. They probably expect the jokester because that is how you usually are. And so I force myself to play the jokester and to act cheerful, even though this is not what I actually feel like in the situation. So this would be over-conformist, over-adapted behavior. And the third variation of how things can go wrong would be communication that is awkward, that is neither true to myself nor true to the situation. Now, you might wonder how you can manage to do something like this. I guess the most likely approach is that you try to adapt and to please, but you misjudge the expectations. So think of the jokester in the stiff business meeting. Imagine that I'm actually a person that is quiet and introverted and not very loud or flashy. But I've heard or read somewhere that in a business context it would be a good idea to be loud and cheerful and happy and tell jokes, because this will make everybody like you and you will get along well with everybody. So I force myself to be like that even in that stiff meeting. But I have misjudged the situation. The other participants don't actually appreciate the jokester, but they are very displeased with this performance. So I end up with communication that does not fit the situation, is not appropriate to the situation, and that is not in accordance with myself, that is not authentic. So how do I figure out what the requirements of the situation are? This is actually not that easy. The example I just gave was maybe a bit oversimplified. I guess you are all aware that it is not good behavior and not good taste to tell jokes at a funeral. However, in day-to-day life and day-to-day business, misunderstandings will be less obvious. Schulz von Thun gives an example here. There is a meeting between the representative of a company and an external consultant. And after they've greeted each other, the representative of the company says, "Oh, well, so please start." And the consultant is confused and says, "What? I thought you would start." And the background is the representative of the company invited different external consultants to different appointments, and he expected this to be a kind of job interview where they would tell a bit about themselves and their approach and what they could do for him. However, the external consultant understood this in a totally different way. He thought this would be the first consulting session where the client would explain to him what the problem is and what kind of help he would request from the consultant. I guess small misunderstandings like that are quite common in day-to-day life and business, and I guess they illustrate that it is not that easy to always judge a situation correctly. And it is not possible to do this with mathematical precision. However, we can do pretty well if we ask the correct questions. And Schulz von Thun has come up with a simple model for that. This model is for figuring out the truth of the situation. And it leans a bit towards formal meetings like business meetings. However, it can also be applied to informal meetings that are about your relationship, your friends, your family. In such cases, some aspects obviously won't be relevant. It looks like this. We have an entrance. We have what Schulz von Thun calls an upper belly. We have a lower belly, and we have an exit. So what are they all about? The entrance stands for the previous history, the events that led up to this situation. A basic question to ask here is, who invited everybody to this meeting and why and under whose orders? And also, what happened before this meeting? Who discussed what with whom? It is important to note here that different participants may have different previous history or a different understanding of the previous history. Maybe some participants discussed certain matters and came to conclusions and decisions among themselves, but other participants don't know about this yet. So it is very important in the very beginning to clarify the previous history and to get to a common understanding. The upper belly stands for the topic, for the thematic structure of the meeting, of the situation. Here, the question is, what is this all about? What topics are on the agenda today? Here it might be a good idea to clearly differentiate what is on the agenda and what is not. Schulz von Thun gives a nice example here of a woman working in youth welfare, and she does a mediation session with a married couple who is about to get a divorce. And it is about what should happen with the children, who should take care of the children. So at the very beginning, she says to that couple, all right, today we want to figure out what is best for the children. This is not about why the marriage failed or whose fault it was. And I think it is quite helpful and quite important to clarify something like this at the very beginning. The conversation might still drift in that direction, but at least it will be easier to get everybody back on track, to remind everybody that at the very beginning you agreed that this is the topic you want to talk about. So I think this is quite a good idea. Other questions that are interesting is, what is the structure of this topic? So what different areas are there? What subtopics are there? This can be quite interesting. And also it's interesting to ask about the status. Which areas have already been clarified and are well known and well understood, and everybody that needs to be done is done, and which areas are still vague and unclear and have uncertainties and have unfinished tasks. Here again, it is very important to get to a common understanding so everybody knows what the topic is, and everybody has the same understanding of the topic and the agenda. The lower belly stands for the participants, for the interpersonal structure of the situation. This is about the question, who is present and why? And this is quite a complex question, because you have to consider that people may be there in different roles and different functions, and maybe they might represent other people that are not present, other parties that are not present, and they might have different interests in the situation. Schulz von Thun talks about different hats that people wear. This becomes more clear if you think about court proceedings. Imagine a court session, and there is someone present who is usually an executive of some company, but today, in this court context, he is the defendant. And he is there because he was ordered to come by the court, but he also has a strong personal interest in the situation because it might turn out badly for him. And another person is present who is usually a policewoman, but today she has the role of witness. And she has no personal interest in the proceedings, however, she has a professional interest because it is part of her job. So you see there quite complex patterns emerge easily, and this question about who is here and why, this is actually quite complex. Another question that is very important in this regard is, do those present fit the occasion and the topic and the objectives? Do we have the right people present? Are there maybe people who are here and no one really knows why? And are there maybe important people missing? Now, this might not be easily fixable, but at least it should be clear and known to everybody. Finally, the exit stands for the goals of the meeting. The question here is, what objectives should be achieved today? Again, it is helpful to differentiate what is an objective today and what is not. And again, it is important to keep in mind that different participants might have different objectives, different interests in the situation. So here again, it is very important to come to a common understanding, to agree on common objectives. You've probably already noticed what typical problems are. There are two main areas where things can go wrong. The first problem is that the situation might be intransparent. So the previous history, the objectives, the topic, the participants are not clear and comprehensible to everybody. Maybe some participants don't know all of the previous history. Maybe participants have a different understanding of the topic. Maybe they have different objectives and different understandings of the objectives. In this case, it is very important to get to a common understanding, to clarify what the meeting is about in the very beginning before the actual discussions start. And the other problem that might arise is that the situation is not coherent. So the previous history, topics, objectives, participants, they don't actually fit together. Maybe the wrong people are there. Maybe the right people are missing. Maybe the topic doesn't fit the objectives and the previous history. Maybe there are contradictions. And in such a case, the problem might not be possible to fix the problem on the fly and right there within the situation, but at least it should be clear to everybody, and everybody should understand that there are those problems. If a facilitator is present, it is his task to make sure that there is transparency and that there is coherence. And even if there is an informal situation, something that concerns relationship, family, friends, it is still important to make sure there is transparency and there is coherence before the actual discussion starts. Schulz von Thun has summed up his model in one simple guiding question that can be used to clarify the truth of the situation. And it is as follows. The translation is by myself. How did it come to be? Previous history. And what sense does it make? Objectives. That you and me, of all people, participants, would like to work on this topic together. This question should always be clarified before the actual discussion, the actual proceedings start. However, even if you have clarified that question, there might still be some things might still remain unclear. Because what we need to do is we should not just focus on the situation by itself and that which is within the situation, but we should also take a step back, look at the systemic context and look at the big picture. Schulz von Thun gives an example here. I have modified it slightly to make it better comprehensible, of a sales workshop in a company. So the participants are the salespeople, and there is a trainer who tries to teach them new sales strategies. However, their reactions are entirely negative. Oh, this will never work. This is old stuff. We already know this. It's useless. We are not interested. If we just look at the situation by itself, we won't be able to really figure out what went wrong here. However, it quickly becomes obvious if we look at the systemic context. First of all, we have the company on one side and the customers on the other. And there may always be some conflicts between them. Maybe the customers are not pleased with the product, with the service, with the marketing strategy. There may be some problems. And the first ones to suffer from those are the salespeople, because they are the first ones the upset customers will approach. So they get kind of torn between the company and the customers. And furthermore, we have a top to bottom situation. At the very top, we have the company and the marketing department, where there are the thinkers and planners who come up with the marketing strategy. The actual salespeople now, they have a lot of experience and knowledge as well, but no one asks them anything. Their knowledge is not used, their experience is not considered. The marketing strategy is created without any input from them. And the trainer is a mere intermediate, so he will have to forward this marketing strategy from the marketing department to the salespeople, and the salespeople are merely expected to execute. They are expected to do as they are told and put that marketing strategy they had no say in into action. And it's quite obvious that they will not be pleased about that. So if we look at the systemic context, it's easy to understand why this sales workshop didn't work out well, and we can find ways to fix things. Now, apart from looking at the systemic context and the big picture, we also need to go small and return to our very selves. Because once we have figured out what the requirements of the situation are, we need to act accordingly. And here we need to rely on Schulz von Thun's inner team again. I already made 2 videos about it. I will link to them in the video description. To quickly sum it up, the basic idea is that the different thoughts and feelings and impulses within ourselves, the different facets of our personality, that they make up different members of an inner team, and that we are the leader of that inner team. So if we are in a certain situation that requires a certain kind of behavior, the right members of our inner team need to be present and need to be on the playing field. For example, think of that jokester in my earlier examples. If I am in a nice social gathering with friends and I am in a good mood, this jokester should certainly be on the playing field because he's the perfect team member for this occasion. However, if I move on to the stiff business meeting, this jokester should leave the playing field and wait on the side because he is not appropriate in that situation. And we are actually able to quickly change our entire inner setup, our inner constellation of team members. Schulz von Thun gives an example here of a married couple, a bit cliche, I know. The wife complains that when her husband arrives back home after work, he is always in a very bad mood. He is broody and grumpy, and he is sitting on his favorite chair with a gloomy look on his face, and he is reading, and you better don't approach him and better don't talk to him. However, if the phone rings and the customer calls, there is an instant transformation. Good evening, how can I help you? But the instant the phone call has ended, he's back to his gloomy, broody, grumpy self again. So we are able to switch our inner team members in an instant, to change our inner team setup from one moment to the next. And this is quite important and necessary in day-to-day life. Think of the following example. You are in a meeting or in a workshop and you are to act as the facilitator. At the beginning, there will be a phase where you greet everybody, so you need a friendly host who is able to feel everybody welcome and create a nice atmosphere. Then you need an attentive detective who determines the truth of the situation. And you need a patient explainer who explains to everybody what the meeting is about and what is expected of them. A bit later, there is maybe a brainstorming where ideas are to be collected without being evaluated. There you don't need the explainer and detective and host anymore. They have to wait on the side, while you need a relaxed supporter on the playing field. Someone who is able to motivate and support the participants to come up with a lot of ideas, but who will not bring up any ideas by himself and not voice his own opinions and viewpoints and ideas. And a bit later, there is probably again an entirely different phase again, that is about implementation. And here the relaxed supporter has to go, because now you need a sharp critic who will question things like, is this really doable? Do we have the money? Is it possible in that amount of time? And you also need a conscientious planner who makes sure that all steps that are necessary are taken into consideration and everybody knows what he has to do and what everybody else has to do, and that all aspects are taken into consideration and nothing is forgotten. So we constantly switch our inner team setup, and we need to do so to adapt to each new situation. Now, the things that can go wrong here are pretty much the same as for an actual team and the same as we discussed previously in the model about situations. We can have a team setup that does not fit the situation. First, we can have a team member present who is not appropriate for the situation, such as if we have that jokester in the stiff business meeting, this won't turn out very well. And the other problem that can arise is that we have a vacancy. A team member that we would need in this situation is not present. Imagine that workshop where you are the facilitator and you are greeting the participants, but the attentive detective is missing. So you forget to determine the truth of the situation, and later on there are plenty of problems because it turns out everybody has a different understanding of what the meeting is about and what the objectives are. If you consciously deal with the situation and clarify the guiding question and make sure there is transparency and coherence, then it becomes much easier to figure out what is required of you in the situation and to come up with the inner team setup that fits the situation and to communicate in a way that is appropriate to the situation. By the way, is this one of those situations where you click the like button and subscribe to the channel? What do you think? I think it should at least lead up to another encounter next week when we discuss another exciting topic. Because in a book review we will have a look at The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker. For today I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.